over there in Twickenham, right near London, I've got Don Craine from the legendary Downliners Sect. Hello, Don.
Hi, Nick. Good to hear from you.
And it's great to hear that you're still alive and the soothsayer was wrong.
Yes, oh dear me. Never believe the sooth. It's nonsense. Make your own fate.
What did he charge you? Do you remember?
No, I don't remember. I'd just come out of the Studio 51 club to go home. I was very, very drunk, and he looked so much like Gandalf, I thought I'd trust him. And he had all these charts in the tube station. I don't think I gave him very much. Obviously not enough. He told me I'd be dead before I was 30, but in actual fact, obviously I wasn't. But on the strength of that, I totally enjoyed myself and pretty much spent all the money. By the time I was 30, my first marriage had well split up and my house had been sold and I hadn't any work for a while. I wasn't dead, but near enough.
So you're only 31 now, is that right, Don?
74 now. Oh, God.
You have put shame to that soothsayer guy.
Yeah, wonderful. Never trust somebody that looks like Gandalf.
Were you born in Twickenham? Where were you born?
I was actually born in Chiswick. Irish father, English mother. Obviously a child of them having a good time at Hammersmith Palais during the war.
Where's Chiswick? Is that near the Hammersmith?
Yeah, that's not very far from here, a little more in towards London. And then we were off to Ireland for a year or three, and then back here, and came to this town in 1950, I think.
Right, okay. So you were still a very young lad when you came.
Definitely, yes, yeah.
Being Irish, you've got a bit of an Irish name, Mick O'Donnell.
That's right, yeah. Well, a lot of the family's still there, thankfully. My father decided to come here. Apparently, on the boat over, he changed his mind, decided he wanted to go home, but he felt embarrassed about admitting defeat, so he carried on. As I say, I think he met my mum at the Hammersmith Palais on a Saturday night, dancing to Lou Prager and his band, apparently.
If he had gone back home, you would have never existed.
Well, that's right, or I'd have been doing something else.
Where did the interest in music start?
Strangely enough, my father was tone deaf, but he told me all the old Irish songs, but to me they were just poetry. My mother was a terrific piano player. She read music, but she used to busk a lot. So whenever we were on a holiday to Ireland, when we were in the pub, she'd knock out tunes. Everybody adored her. And my English grandfather been in the Salvation Army until they chucked him out when he got drunk. But he played trombone and he played accordion, concertina and a few things. He made banjos and ukuleles. And I was made to do piano lessons as a kid. Most of the people I knew were forced into the slavery of piano lessons, mainly because our parents had an upright piano and didn't want to waste the damn thing. Yeah.
Oh, well, fair enough. I suppose they would have cost a fortune back in those days, a piano.
Yeah, indeed. But, of course, I used to worry at school. All the people I was at school with were going on about what they wanted to do. They wanted to be bank managers or lawyers or this. I didn't want to really do anything. And then along came Lonnie Donegan and his skiffle music, and it totally changed my life. I realised with 3 chords you could really enjoy yourself, probably at somebody else's expense. All the ladies enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic.
You left your chewing gum overnight on the bedpost as
well. Yeah, so by the time I was about 12, I was in a skiffle group with my best friend at school who played tea-chest bass and another guy who played washboard, and I played guitar. And our first appearance was at Strawberry Fair in Twickenham in the grounds of the famous Strawberry Hill, which was one of the first Gothic mansion in England. So that was lovely. We were in a talent contest and were beaten by a young girl dressed in Tyrolean attire singing Gilly Gilly Bloody Ossum Pfeffer, Katzenella Bogan by the Sea. Put me off Tyrolean music, but give me a taste for playing guitar.
Maybe the girl had talent.
Maybe she did. We certainly didn't, you know. I know that. But the trio we were called the Cool Three, which wasn't that creative, that transmogrified into a school rock and roll band, which we called the Downliners, from Jerry Lee Lewis B-side. I think it was the B-side of Breathless. It was called Down the Line. Then by 1961, the school band had become quite serious, and we were doing gigs all over the place, ballrooms and all that, and just about staying at school. December 62, we turned professional to go and play American bases in France. That went horribly wrong because the agent had told everybody we had a girl singer, which we didn't have. so the American troops weren't that impressed. So our 3-month tour ended up as 1 month.
Nobody bothered to wear a wig?
It would have been dangerous in the old army camp there.
Fair enough.
On a Saturday night, wearing a wig there, you could have been in a lot of trouble.
They would have got a nasty surprise, and they wouldn't have been...
Oh, very nice, yeah, and you'd have probably got a nastier one.
Yes, I think you might have got...
Came back, there was a bit of trouble. After a while, I found that I had a lot of work and just a drummer. I got rid of the rest of the band, various arguments, etc., etc. And it was worrying because the drummer had given up. He was doing a 2-year apprenticeship. I talked him into giving it up to come and play drums on this supposed tour about 3 months before his apprenticeship finished. So when it turned out there wasn't a band except myself and the drummer, his parents weren't best pleased. So I put a few adverts out. And the first person that answered the ad, I put an ad out for a bass, lead guitar and singer. And this guy turned up. His name was Keith Evans, but Keith Grant, he called himself. I said, what do you do? And bugger me, he said, I'm a drummer. I thought the only thing I've got is a drummer. And I told him what I needed. And he played a bit of acoustic guitar and we sat down all the afternoon playing all the songs we knew between us. And we got on really well. So his dad said, well, if I buy him a bass guitar and an amp, can he be the bass player? And nobody else had applied for the job, so I said, fine. So he did, and he taught himself how to play bass, and he's been the singing bass guitarist ever since. And then we got a lead guitarist in, Melvin Lewis. He was really good R&B player, but after a few months, his dad made him go off to university, so we looked around and got hold of a guy that had been in a band we've been working with a few times. His name was Terry Clemson, just 16 years old, and he came in, and he was terrific, enthusiastic, really talented, and we put it all together, and within 3 weeks, we were out doing gigs and playing R&B. Luckily, not many people outside of London knew anything about the R&B movement, which had only just begun. By the time they'd learnt what the music was all about, we'd actually learned to play it quite well. Worked out well to show our enthusiasm and to make it a bit different, because I'm interested in things like ritual magic. We changed the name to the Downliners Sect, and off we went. And apart from a little short break between about 69 and 75, we've been rolling ever since.
That's not a bad track record there. You're still going 57 years later.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I just expected it to be a very short-lived thing. We started our school, as I say, little rock and roll band, and one of the gigs we played was the Ealing Club, another place in West London. And while we were there, Alexis Corner and Art Wood and Cyril Davis came along looking for a gig because they'd been thrown out of the venue where they had a club in London, and they set up the Ealing Club there. People like Paul Jones and Phil May, Dick Taylor, people from the Pretty Things, etc., Manfred Mann, myself and all the rest of it, all the little spots there. And although I didn't particularly like what Alexis Corner did personally, he was wonderful, encouraging people and all the rest of it. He made everybody feel welcome, and he promoted the idea of blues and rhythm and blues. But what he did didn't suit me, and we also used to go to places like the Flamingo and see the Blue Flames, originally Earl Watson and the Blue Flames.
Not Georgie?
No, Georgie took over when Earl Watson, who was the leader sax player, departed, and he took over. But they were very, very jazzy bass. That wasn't quite what I wanted at all. One week, when I wasn't working, I went over to Eel Pie Island, which is right near me, a little island in the Thames, and they used to have gigs on. And I went to see Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages, because they'd been starting doing rock and roll there. And the first time I went over, Sutchy was there, and he was great. So I went back months later when he came, and he wasn't there. There was this little bald guy there. The Savages were there, but they were fronted by this little bald chappie who looked like a bank manager in a suit. And he started playing harmonica, and I thought, oh, this is fantastic. Who the hell is that? And I thought I recognised him, and I suddenly realised that it was Cyril Davis, who'd been playing with Alexis Corner and Art Wood at the Ealing Club. And him and the Savages Without Suchy were calling themselves the Cyril Davis Rhythm and Blues All-Stars. And it was the most marvellous music I'd ever heard in my life. I thought, there we go. I've been trying to find the sort of R&B that suited the band, and this was it. And from that night on, I was totally dedicated. Cyril totally inspired me. And then, I don't know, about 6 weeks later, a friend of mine said, you've got to come along and listen to this band in Richmond, which is about half a mile down the road here. And we went along to the station hotel, opposite the station, obviously. Huge queue, and we got in, and of course it was the Stones, one of the Stones' first gigs at the Station Hotel in Richmond, and that was another revelation. I thought, that's it. Playing like Cyril and all the rest of them was great, but in my mind I could see that that was only ever going to work in jazz clubs and have a very limited appeal, however great it was. But the second I saw Jagger and Richards and Co. up there at the Station Hotel, that's it. It's like a shiver down the spine. That was the way that rhythm and blues was going to reach the public. And it was indisputable right from the very beginning. So then I got basically with the Downliners Sect. It was, to me, I wanted it to sound like Cyril Davis and look a bit like the Stones.
Yeah, what were you playing before then?
Well, the skiffle became rock and roll, and the rock and roll started to become a little bit of rhythm and blues, but we called ourselves a rhythm and blues band, but we were just adding a bit of Muddy Waters and Jimmy Reed to a lot of Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley, which we were already playing as a rock and roll band. In the 60s, everybody thought of Chuck and Bo as rhythm and blues stars, but of course in the 50s they were rock and roll. Same songs, exactly the same actions, because the thing kicked off the R&B thing in England. Most of us, me included, thought of it not as a euphemism for Negro music, but as an actual type of music, like rock and roll and jazz and country and western. We all thought, well, a lot of us did, that rhythm and blues was a style of music, which it wasn't, of course. It included all different types of black acts. That's what it meant. Rhythm and blues meant black music in America. Here, it wasn't just the black person's music, which was all-encompassing but not allowed on white radio in America. It seemed to us like it was an actual form of music.
Well, I think the racism at the time in America, white people didn't listen to the rhythm and blues, as you call it.
Oh, it was ridiculous. I mean, it was wonderful for the English acts. To me, that's largely why the English were so successful, like there was a British invasion, because they started listening to what we were doing, and what we were doing, by and large, was a pale shadow of their black music. They had no idea of that, because only a few people would ever listen to a black radio station, a few white people. They had no idea it was actually American music. They thought it was British.
You were selling it back to them.
Yeah, but not intentionally. Assumed they knew exactly what it was.
You, the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, Pretty Things, even the Kinks were doing, on the first album, they had Beautiful Delilah on their first album as well. So
exactly, yeah. Everybody's doing it, but we thought it was a type of music. It wasn't, of course. That's how the British sound evolved. By mistaken identity, if anything else, trying to emulate something that we weren't really culturally part of. I mean, later you get films like The Commitments, where they say the Irish are like the blacks of Europe sort of thing, but it's a nice thing. And I, obviously, as a kid, I did grow up here with the no blacks, no dogs, no Irish in the window when my parents were looking for somewhere to live. But by and large, my dad started identifying more with black people when there was riots here in the 50s. The British government invited West Indians to come over here and work, and when they did, they got treated very, very badly. So there were riots and things, and the Irish and the Jews and the blacks always tended to team up together to defend themselves against the right wing. My dad knew loads of black people, but they were West Indians that were over here. They weren't American blacks at all. The only American black people here were in the forces during and after the war. You had people like Geno Washington, who was, I think he was in the American Air Force in Norfolk. He was stationed. And people like that. And they used to come and sing at the jazz clubs. Gino Washington, Ronnie Jones, who used to have a band called the Nighttimers. But most of the black people in England in the late 50s and 60s were of West Indian origin rather than US citizens. We didn't really culturally totally identify with the American Negroes. I mean, not many English people have ever worked in a cotton field, really. As far as I know, I've never met anybody that actually did.
Don, it might be a bit chilly in England to grow cotton there somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, Don, I want to get onto your name. So from Mick O'Donnell, how did you choose Don Craine?
Well, the Don, people called me Don at school from the O'Donnell, because the name O'Donnell is all tied up with ancient Celtic peoples who worshipped gods and goddesses of the rivers, like the Don and the Danube and all the rest of it. So they called me Don at school as an abbreviation of my name O'Donnell. They started off calling me the O'Donnell because that's what the leader of the O'Donnells used to be called. But they jokingly used to call me the O'Donnell. It ended up as Don. And about 25 yards from my house is a little river called the Craine. Crane. I just added an I in the middle of it and called myself Don Craine. When I felt jazzy, my first stage name was Alcatraz. That made me cringe.
Hey, Al, how are you?
Yeah, yeah. So then after that, I wanted to sounding a little jazzy. I called myself Sonny Craine. And then everybody started calling me Stormy Tractor. So I abandoned that.
Don, you sound like one of those porn stars.
Yeah, we had one of them in the band at a later stage. Anyway, yeah, so I became Don Craine instead and have remained that ever since.
That's a good name. I like it. It's a great name.
It's not bad.
It's worked for 55, nearly 60 years.
It has. Yeah. Like the hat. Our old lead guitarist, Terry Gibson, he actually loathes the hat, and he still does. I don't blame him, but it has actually worked. I don't know if your listeners know, but I wear a deerstalker hat on stage.
Don, I hope you've got it on now, because this is business.
I haven't. I have it beside me, but I don't like to wear a hat in the house. Yeah, I mean, that cropped up because we were one time booked to play for the Duke of Rutland. We went up to do the gig, and as I say, being London Irish, I like to have a little pop now and again. So I wore the deerstalker hat as a mild gesture of taking the mickey out of the English gentry. And on top of that, I tried it out the day before at a gig in the West End at one of our regular venues of Studio 51. And everybody was talking about the hat, and I came up with the idea that I wore it because Jack the Ripper, the only time he was spotted for a second, he was apparently wearing a deerstalker hat. So that always appealed to me. And on top of that, in the Hammer Sherlock Holmes type films, they always had the detective wearing a deerstalker hat. And if you were in a pub playing a gig and you had a whip round hanging onto those two flaps, you could really get a lot of money in that hat. So they were the reasons I claimed, but the real reason I wore the hat is because I wanted to take the mickey out of the Duke of Rutland, who in the event turned out to be a really, really nice guy, but that's how the hat began.
I thought you wanted to quit music and become a detective like Sherlock.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Good idea. No, it was just pouncing about looking a little bit Victorian, really.
It looked good on Basil Rathbone.
It looked terrific on Basil Rathbone, but unfortunately, you see, it didn't mean it was going to look good on me. It's like certain people who watch the fashion shows and see what's fashionable in the shops. They think, oh, it looks great on the models, it's going to look great on me, and quite often it doesn't.
It is a strange shaped hat for a start.
Yeah.
Don, your mum, who you mentioned before, playing the piano and busking and all that, she became your manager, the manager of the band.
She did. With the original Downliners, we had a manager who actually promoted gigs himself just to put us on, and it went really well for 6 months or more. And then at one gig, the deal was that he'd put on the show, we'd play and split the money between us. And we found one night, we didn't have a licence for any of these gigs, an alcohol licence, and we found that while we were on, he was selling booze to everybody in the dressing room. Well, fine with us, but he wasn't splitting the money. He was keeping all that for himself. So we decided to part company, and my mum stepped in, and she was the manager all through our career. We got different agents, but she managed the band, and we used to promote gigs and then had a little agency where if the Downliners couldn't do a gig, we'd put another local band in, and we had a little scene going for a while. So yeah, and she managed us right up until the end of our first real stint, probably about the end of the 60s.
Well, I'm glad she didn't try and jib you.
Well, that was my reasoning. I'd sometimes go with the chancer of an agent who I knew was going to rip us off, but if they were going to rip us off and we were still going to make a lot of money, that was okay. That's the way the world is. But I knew my mum wouldn't rip me off, and there'd be real bloody trouble if she did. Yes. When we did this French tour in the first place, we took all our stuff, all our guitars and amps and PA, carried it all on the train and the boat. We didn't have any transport. Once we got back from that, we'd really had enough. So my dad, who only up until that point had driven a motorbike and sidecar, he learned how to drive a car, passed his test, and went and bought a van, and he drove us around. So my mum managed and my dad rode it. Yeah.
The Downliners Sect release, for your first record, you released your own record, is that right?
Not actually, no. We were playing at the Studio 51 in Soho in central London. We were approached by a crowd called Campbell Films Limited, and they wanted to do a live EP. What they actually did, by and large, they did sound effects for films, creaking chains and woo-woo train effects and clackety-clack and banging the coconut shells together type thing. They used to do albums of sound effects, and they wanted to try and get into music. So they set up a little label called Contrast Sound, and they asked us to guinea pig it, basically. So we agreed, and they came down with their equipment, which was a couple of microphones and a little tape deck, and they had the bass player's dad holding the mic in front of the speaker on the left, my dad holding the mic in front of the speaker on the right of the stage. They had their own guy mixing. We recorded this EP.
Sounds very high-tech there, Don.
Terrifically so, yeah. I mean, we were up there with the discovery of nuclear fission, and it was an EP, and they called it At Night in Great Newport Street. And because of the sort of company they were, it starts off with all the traffic in Piccadilly Circus and Leicester Square, and you hear somebody gradually approaching the club, and you hear them walking down the metal stairs, and the music's getting louder. It's terrific. It's a little story in itself. And we did 4 tracks, and basically I've probably pressed up about 1,000 of them, something like that. And so it wasn't our production, but it was one of the first little indie productions in the country.
They'd be worth a bit of money now, collectors.
Oh yeah, they're worth over $1,000 each. 20 years ago, you could get 800 quid for them. But the really important thing to me was that they sold them at this club, the Studio 51, where the Stones and ourselves had a residency. And on one occasion, unbeknownst to us, a young Swedish girl who was over here on holiday bought a copy of the EP and really loved it. Took it back to Sweden, and 6 months later or so, we signed with Campbell Connolly Publishers, who put us with EMI. Our first single in Sweden turned out to be Little Egypt, and the girl was the daughter of the head of EMI in Stockholm, and she got her dad to put it out in Sweden, and it went right up to the top of the charts, unbeknownst to us. So one Sunday afternoon, we're playing at the Studio 51 for 20 quid between us, and this Swedish guy comes down and says, "Would you like to play at a stadium in Stockholm?" We said, "Great, how are we going to get there?" And he says he'll charter a plane for us. It was fantastic. So off we went to play the ice hockey stadium in Stockholm. We had support band Sounds Incorporated and a girl band called the Dollies, all sitting on the plane waiting for us to show up, especially chartered for us. It was wonderful. Off we went to Stockholm, played to thousands.
Speaking of Sounds Incorporated, when the Beatles came to Australia, they were the support band, so they supported you and the Beatles.
Yeah, they were terrific. They were so versatile. They were great in their own right, and great as a support band, and great as a backing group.
So having a big hit in Sweden, did that help you back at home in England?
No, quite the opposite, as it turned out.
Oh, why?
We had a wonderful time when we did go to Sweden, but the time we spent there, people started to forget about us here, and we never quite made up our minds where to be. I think we lost ground by being abroad. It was great for Sweden, because now we still play there. It's great.
You might have inspired those ABBA people, for all you know.
Yes, indeed.
I'm sure they would have rocked up. Young Benny and Bjorn.
Oh, yeah. One of them was in a band. When I say we played the ice hockey stadium in Stockholm, don't know which one it was. One of those two guys was in one of our support bands there back in 64, probably, yeah.
I think they covered a lot of English-speaking songs.
Yeah, because there were some great bands out there. The Targers and the Hep Stars, Ola and the Yanglers. This guy was one of those, and I can't remember which one he was in. He was rocking even then.
So did you have day jobs when you were doing this in the early...
Well, on and off, but the last day job I had was before I went out to play France in December 62. I was a cellar man. I couldn't work in the bar because I wasn't old enough, but I used to stock up the bar and bottle up, and I let the guy down and buggered off just before Christmas to go and play in France. But apart from that, I've just done odd jobs over the years. You know, I've been a cleaner and a grave digger.
Sounds like old Roddy Stewart.
Yeah, same thing. Ian. Everybody gets by when you can. I've been an usher in the cinema. If I never see Fantasia again, it'll be too soon. I saw it twice a day for 3 weeks, and that was enough. I dreamt about dancing hippos for weeks.
The music was good, though, wasn't it?
The music was great.
Don, what's it like being in the Downliners Sect? Because you, the Pretty Things and the Yardbirds and the Stones, but you were the guys that remained the truest, because the Pretty Things, they dabbled in psychedelia and rock operas, and the Rolling Stones, they went sort of more rocky. You kept a bit more pure, if that's the right word?
Yeah, I think so. That's what I wanted. I think individually we probably do like all different types of music, but I think the Downliners Sect weren't really suited to anything else. That's why I didn't adapt the band in the late 60s. You had lovely vocal outfits like the Beach Boys doing great, and you had the heavy metal starting to come in, and then you had bands that developed the blues music, and they were back to the saxes, the horn sections. None of that was for me, or if it was for me, it wasn't with the Downliners Sect. I like the Downliners Sect as a rocking R&B entity. We've tried to stick to that. We've lots of original songs, but that's always been the theme. It's never gone too far away from it, apart from the odd album track.
But, Don, you did go, first you went country and then you went punk.
Certainly. Punk was nothing to do with us. The country, yes. I've always been more interested in having a good time than actually having a hit, if you like. So when it came to albums in the 60s, to me they were an indulgence. If we were going to do something for our fans, that would be the singles. To me, an album, you could indulge yourself a little bit. And I was always interested in what British R&B was all about. And I came to the conclusion that it was actually a mixture of country blues filtered partially through people like Lonnie Donegan and some of the 50s music that used to get on pretentious BBC programmes with maybe Rosetta Tharpe and Muddy Waters, Josh White, people like this. And on top of that, little bits of country influence like Hank Williams and all that, which was an influence on the radio in people's childhood. So I thought, well, maybe British R&B is a little bit of a combination of city blues, country blues, folk music, bit of country and western. So we did what I thought was basically a bluesy R&B album the first time. That's the Sect. Then the Country Sect, to show it wasn't really country or western as such. It was a nod and appreciation of people like Lonnie Donegan and Hank Williams that had contributed to my life, at least, and Keith, when we were growing up and brought us to where we were. So it was saying thanks very much for skiffle and a bit of country. And then the next album, The Rock Sect's In, was a bit more rock and roll based because, once again, I thought that rock and roll and R&B were related. I think rock and roll, to me me especially, contributed to my love of R&B, because when I first fell really in love with it, it was Cyril Davis and his blues harmonica with Screaming Lord Sutch's rock and roll band behind it. That's what made it great to me. So that's what that albums were all about. It was a bit of a dissection of what I considered British R&B to be. It wasn't probably in the interest of the band, neither was it interesting the public particularly, especially the country album, which went down pretty badly. Although in Sweden we had a top 10 hit with I Got Mine, and 3 hot hundreds over here with tracks from it. But nevertheless, people didn't understand it. I didn't bother explaining because I wasn't that interested ever in what people thought. I played the music to have a good time and avoid the daily grind.
Which you've done quite successfully for such a long time, Don.
Bit of luck. We were all lucky. Our little group of us, like Yardbirds, Pretties, ourselves, was that the new mods picked it all up. And the garage people, for some reason, they like us all. Young people's gigs for years, and it's been great fun. That's where the punk... you asked... Sorry, I've been rambling. You asked about the punk connection.
Yes.
When in, I think it was 1974, 75, I'm not sure, Charlie Records put the Sect album out, reissued the Sect album that they got hold of. And they, right across the front of it, they wrote the words, "Punk from the Vaults." And all the punks suddenly started listening to us. The garage bands at the time were already into us, because some of the bands like Dr. Feelgood and the Kersal Flyers, when asked where they got their inspiration, they'd mention the Pretty Things in the Downliners Sect, maybe the Kinks. So the garage crowd had heard of us, but with the release of this thing called Punk from the Vaults, which went to number 12 in the punk charts over here, we started getting interest and getting booked by all the punk clubs all over the country. And the same thing happened to the Pretty Things and the Yardbirds, and to an extent the Pirates.
Don, did you have to spit on stage?
No, we didn't. We just had to avoid that with people that were spitting. And it was great in the dressing rooms, because all the chicks that were in bands wanted to make a point of showing how punk they were, so they were all getting changed in front of us and all that and being really cool, which was great. We just sat and watched. But I was used to that, because in the short time, the Downliners weren't the Downliners from about, 69, 74. I had an Irish duo called Finnegan's Wake singing rebel songs all over the place, Irish rebel songs. A lot of the gigs we used to do were cabaret-type gigs, so there'd be a comedian and a woman singer and a bloody conjurer or something, but also there'd always be a couple of strippers, and it was wonderful. My partner and I at the time had just had a child, so I was out on the road with a little 6-month-old baby, and it was great. All the strippers would look after the baby while I was on. So I was used to people sort of staying nude and all that in the dressing room, but it continued through the punk era, so that was fun as well. Gigs were wonderful.
I hope you didn't get poked by a stray safety pin.
Well, yeah, occasionally, yes.
Oh, no. Oh.
But it was great fun, and it's just continued ever since. It's only slowing down a bit now because I have to book things in advance, and our lead guitarist now lives in the south of France, so that has to be organised when we tour, and our harmonica player, who's John O'Leary, one of the founders of the Savoy Brown Blues Band, he spends a lot of time in Belgrade because his wife's Serbian and he loves it out there. So I have to give everybody plenty of notice.
Where's Keith these days?
He lives over in Wimbledon. He's fine. We do individual things as well, but as well as the Downliners Sect, Keith and I work together in a thing called the Eel Pie All-Stars. We have an Eel Pie club still going in Twickenham, and it's a has-beens graveyard round here, so we got people from the Pirates and the Kinks and the Pretties. When any of us are not working, we just put ourselves together with the Eel Pie All-Stars, and off we go. Like the Sunday just gone, we were doing a Twickenham 60s Day on the riverside. Glorious weather, hundreds of people. And the week before that, we topped the bill at the Ealing Blues Festival. So when the Downliners aren't working, we got the Eel Pie All-Stars. And when they're not working, Keith and I do all different guest spots and different things. So we're still jogging along.
I think the secret is why a lot of young people appreciate the Downliners Sect is that you guys have got integrity, because the Stones, every one of those bands in a way, sold out. And I'm a big Doors fan. And there's one thing about The Doors have never sold. They got offered $10 million about 15 years ago for a car company to use Light My Fire.
Yeah, and they said shove it, did they?
They said shove it, and there was such an uproar in America that they knocked it back.
Oh.
Can you believe it? The conservative commentators actually had a go at, because Jim Morrison knocked back Big Money in the 60s. The drummer, he said, no, Jim Morrison, he wouldn't have wanted this. It's incredible what causes an uproar in America. Somebody knocking back money causes an uproar.
Yeah, a terrible sin.
The Downliners Sect, it seems like every decade there's a revival. There was a revival in the 70s because of the punks. In the 80s, a great live album. And then you had a guy called Mick Ober, I think, and he...
Oh, that was wonderful fun. Really good fun. What happened there was, it was when reformed Downliners, which was Keith, Johnny Sutton, myself and Terry Gibson, there was a little bit of a fallout between Keith and Terry. So Keith, he was fine, but Terry got upset with Keith's behaviour at one stage. We all have bad periods, and he was saying that he didn't want to work with Keith anymore. But the upshot was that I was told that there was this guy called Mike Over who'd just been in England doing a Yardbirds story video, and he wanted to film the Downliners Sect. He'd been in touch with Terry because that's the only contact he could find, and Terry put me onto it, but he didn't want to work with Keith anymore, so I thought about it, and in the end I parted company with Terry, searched around the London hotels and found this Mike Ober, so we teamed up with him to do a Yardbirds Downliners video where Jim McCarthy, the drummer of the Yardbirds, and the Downliners teamed up and did a little gig, and then we did a video of the Downliners Sect story, and from there Jim, Mike Ober and I formed the British Invasion All-Stars and put together 2 or 3 albums. And the wonderful thing for me was that Mike Ober was great. He worked really hard, he spent loads of money, made all the contacts, but people didn't like him. For some reason, people tended to take against him. So he got me to be the general manager of what was Promised Land Records. So that was great for me. For the first time in my life, I'm phoning up major record companies and agents and all the rest of it and asking to speak to the boss. And instead of being told they're on holiday or they've gone to lunch, I'm put straight through. And it was great fun with the All-Stars. We had Phil and Dick from the Pretties, and we had lead guitarist of Creation, Eddie Phillips, and the lead singer of the Nashville Teens. We had Mickey Green from the Pirates, Jim on drums from the Yardbirds, Keith and myself from the Downliners Sect. So we're having a great time making albums, and I'm also making contact with all these businesses. So that was great, and it ticked off a whole new section of the Downliners going out and doing this, that and the other, and meeting different people in the business, which led to further deals, which led to other albums, what we call the Ambulators. We got another producer. We put together an album, Dave Walker and the Ambulators, David. Oh, we've been with lots of bands. So anyway, that's when the Mike Ober adventure began, and it went on for a long time, and it carried on and ends up where we are now. Mike went back to the States. Don't very often hear from him at all.
Maybe they didn't like him because he was American.
No, it wasn't that. Other Americans didn't like him. He told it as he saw it, which I think offended a lot of people.
It wasn't the wrong deodorant or anything.
It might well have been.
One I want to ask you about is, tell me about the Headcoats.
I first heard from Bruce Brand, the drummer. Didn't know about the Headcoats. He phoned me up and told me that Billy Childish, the artist, poet, singer, songwriter, and this is a guy who's dyslexic, he put together this band called the Headcoats because he'd heard what we did in the 60s, and there's a song we do on an EP called, I think, The Sect Sings 6 Songs, and there's a song called Leader of the Sect, and I sing the words, I took off my hat because it was a deer stalker. Billy heard it and he thought I sang, I took off my head coat, it was a deer stalker. Brilliant, much better line altogether. I wish I had thought of it. But he misheard, and so he called his band the Headcoats as a tribute to my hat. The deer stalker is the Headcoat. So Bruce said, would you like to come along and do some recording with us? So, yeah, lovely. So off I went to where they were. We went into the studio and did an EP and called the EP The Headcoat Sect. Obviously, it's a combination of myself and the Headcoats. So that did reasonably well, got a few pleasant comments here and there. So Billy said, do you fancy doing an album? So then I thought, great. So we got Keith in as well. So we called the band the Headcoat Sect rather than the title of an EP. And we did 2 albums together called Ready, Sect, Go, and God knows I forget what the other one is.
Deerstalker Men, I think it was called.
Deerstalking Men, that was fantastic. Keith had to wear a deerstalker as well. Everybody had deerstalkers.
Everyone on the cover is wearing a deerstalker.
That's right. That was great fun. We did the photo for that outside the house that Charles Dickens based Mrs. Faversham's house on. You know, the old lady that never got married in the story.
What was that? Great Expectations?
Yeah, that's the one. That was good fun doing that. And then I think there was a bit of trouble with the Headcoats that they'd had enough. Johnny Johnson, when we played as the Headcoat Sect, he was the bass player, so he went off bass. He played harmonica and Keith played bass. And he didn't like playing America very much, so he decided he wanted out. So they got in touch and said, do you want to be part of the Swan Song? And we went out to Japan with them for a weekend, played the last dub at the Headcoats and the Headcoat Sect. We did a couple of days in Tokyo and then played the last couple of gigs in London with them. And then they folded. And whereas we would have gone to America with them, the following year we did Las Vegas as the Downliners Sect. So that was wonderful.
Where did you play in Vegas, Don?
Yeah, we played 2004. We were co-top of the bill at the Vegas Rock Around.
Okay, not the Flamingo then.
No, the Las Vegas Rock Around. And from there were some Spanish people who saw us in Vegas, and we've been doing a lot of Spanish gigs ever since, so that's been great. Wonderful. Everything always leads to something else.
You're still picking up new fans, Don. That's the secret.
It's wonderful. And we get the strangest deals. We've got this album out called Chinese Whispers, and that was funded by a company in Ireland, Shamrock Solutions, who weren't really interested in the music. They were just doing international deals to make money in Europe. So they gave us thousands and thousands of pounds to make this album, didn't want the money back. We had a lovely time making Chinese Whispers, and so that was great. As I say, our first EP ended up as an inspiration for us being a hit in Sweden. You'd never make the connection. And lately, Keith and I, as I say, we're in the Ill Pie All-Stars, and the promoters of the Ill Pie Club also do other things, and one of them is called the Big Band Blitz. And every year they have a rehash celebration of the 1940s during the war, and they have a band from the time and people singing the Bugle Boy or Company, whatever the hell it is, and everybody wears old uniforms and has a good nostalgic night out. So we went along as just a guest at one of these nights, and their main guest for the night on this occasion was the American military attaché in London. And he'd brought along with him his friend who was an Austrian military attaché. It turns out, when we're all having a cigarette outside the building, that the Austrian military attaché is a huge Headcoats and Downliners Sect fan and thinks we're absolutely wonderful. And he says, I love the Downliners Sect. He said, the only thing is I love to dance. He loves to do all this mod dancing. So he said, by the time I get up to the dance floor and start dancing, the track's finished. You only do short tracks, he said. So he said, what you should do, because everybody's drunk by this time, he says, what you should do, record some of your old songs and make them much longer for the people that like to dance, and make it special. Only put out 50 or 100 of these things and make it a collector's edition. So I said, fine. I said, if a thing's worth doing well, it's worth getting somebody else to pay for it. So he said, okay, I'll pay for it. And I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. Our latest production, we've got this 12-inch vinyl EP called Double Shots with elongated, extended versions of some of our really old songs. And it's going out as a collector's item, funded by the Austrian military attaché, who turns out to be a good dancer and a fan.
Hope you haven't got a disco beat in the background there.
No, none of that.
I thought maybe after all these years you might have wanted to sell out.
No. If we did a disco beat, it would be to take the piss. On our 6 songs EP, we do this song called Now She's Dead. And the chorus, she won't be there, now she's dead. And we deliberately did that like a band called The Bachelors, who are a 60s singing outfit.
Yes, the Irish.
That's it. And I thought they were an absolute discredit to my nation.
Very middle of the road-ish, weren't they?
I mean, they were lovely singers and all that, but I hated all that Charmaine business. So we deliberately sounded like them in a really bad way on the EP. So if you ever hear us doing disco, we're taking the piss.
I just want to mention, Don, that you can get hold of Double Shots and Chinese Whispers at the Downliners Sect website, downlinersect.com.
That's right, yeah, downlinersect.com.
Don,
lovely, yep.
I want to thank you very much for taking time to talk with us.
Thanks for taking the time to give me a ring.
Thanks very much, Don.
That's great talking to you.
So all the best and good health.
Thank you, and the same to you, sir.
And maybe you'll come down to Australia one day.
Hope so, yeah, if I can afford the bloody insurance for the house now.
Well,
I'll get the agent to pay for it.
That's the way to go.
It's a civilised country. This place is getting worse.